At the beginning of the 1900s, power on the world stage was no longer measured solely by guns and cannons. The new tool that determined global dominance was financial infrastructure. As the massive domes of the Bank of England rose into the sky on the streets of London, England was no longer just an island nation, but was transforming into a global financial empire. The rise of the pound was not a stroke of luck. In the last quarter of the 19th century, British banks had established a network capable of controlling not only the national economy, but also trade around the world. The ports of London maritime, transport and insurance networks formed the backbone of this system. Through its colonies, England secured the flow of raw materials and energy and had organized its financial system to align with this. Every major bank and every insurance policy served as a gateway, controlling money flowing through London. During this period, the gold standard grounded the value of money on a concrete foundation and gave rise to the concept of reserve currency, when a currency became a trusted tool, not just within its own country, but in international trade. That country gained a voice in the economic heart of the world. The pound quickly rose to fill this role. The policies of the British Treasury and the Bank of England were closely monitored by international investors and governments. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 showed that financial power could be as deadly as military power. In the first months of the war, England decided to freeze German assets. This cut off Germany's access to international financial markets, disrupted payments, and shook its economic stability. At the time, this move was seen by most historians as just a war tactic, but it was actually the first example in history of using financial sanctions as a systematic weapon. England's strategy was successful. In the short-term, German companies were unable to make payments. Financing became difficult, and the German economy suffered. However, the long-term results began to emerge in ways most observers couldn't see the use of. Financial weapons was not only weakening the enemy, but was reshaping the global financial balance. This period teaches us a very clear lesson. What determines global power is not who holds the guns and cannons, but which doors money is allowed to pass through. England successfully applied this at the beginning of the 20th century and built the world's first invisible empire. But like every empire, the invisible one also had limits, and those limits would become clear as history progressed. 1944 was a turning point in the financial stage of world history. Amid the wreckage of World War II, the leaders of nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, not only to shape post-war peace, but also to create a new economic order. This conference laid the foundation for modern global finance, and the US dollar was crowned as the world's reserve currency. The most critical decision made at the meeting was the pegging of the dollar to gold. The US had accumulated vast production in gold reserves during the war. This advantage turned the dollar from just a national currency into a symbol of international trust and stability. Central banks and governments in every country reshaped their reserves based on trust in the dollar's value. Bretton Woods was not just a monetary conference, but also the birth of international financial architecture. The IMF and World Bank were established. During this period, the IMF served as the last lender of resort in times of economic crises, while the World Bank supported development, ensuring the continuity of global economic stability. This structure solidified the US's power to shape the world economy through the dollar. The British pound was no longer as influential as before. Once the center of world reserves, the pound had lost its credibility in the post-war era and was overshadowed by the rise of the dollar. The US had come to control not only its currency, but also the global financial system. It had taken on the role of lender of last resort. In times of crisis, governments from all corners of the world had to turn to Washington, but behind this power was a fragility. In 1971, President Richard Nixon abandoned the dollar's gold standard. The US's unlimited ability to print money turned the dollar from a gold-backed instrument of trust into one based on military, political, and financial security. The dollar had transformed from just a currency into a global contract. The rest of the world was bound to the agreement of America's stability and trust. However, every contract has an expiration date. The dollar's untouchable status, though, built on invisible power and trust. History has always shown us this. Every empire and every reserve currency has its limits, and one day these limits will be tested. Bretton Woods may have placed the dollar on its throne, but empires endure not through gold or paper, but through strategic decisions that emerge through the test of time. With the end of the Cold War, the world shifted to a unipolar order. The collapse of the Soviets reinforced the economic and political dominance of the West, especially the US in the early 1990s. The global financial scene became, in a sense, a playground under America's control. During this period, the SWIFT network, which was considered the backbone of the international banking system, was effectively placed under US de facto control. A large portion of global payments and transfers were tied to the dollar. Dollar-based trade had become a necessity. The US began to use economic sanctions as a routine weapon. Countries like Iran, Venezuela, and Afghanistan became targets of sanctions that restricted their financial access. Exclusion from the dollar networks caused these countries to suddenly break away from global trade. These sanctions were effective and deterrent in the short term. Many observers interpreted the US's financial power as unavoidable. However, behind this appearance, a quiet search for an alternative had begun. China was continuing its plans to develop its own national payment infrastructure and international trade tools. In the long term, in Asia and other regions, strategic preparations against the US's unilateral use of power were secretly advancing. America's power during this period seemed almost unquestioned. The dollar, SWIFT control, and global financial pressure appeared to be an almost untouchable weapon. Yet history reminds us that absolute power becomes fragile the moment it stops questioning itself. During this period, the US's financial hegemony was undergoing both visible and invisible tests. Quietly, rising alternative systems were sowing the seeds of the future. Multipolar financial world. 1990-2021 period was the era when financial power was most openly and systematically used as a weapon. But this era was also a time when power began testing its own limits, and history has shown repeatedly that moments when the powerful continue without questioning themselves are the first signs of their downfall. 2022 became a turning point in which financial power was used as the sharpest weapon, yet this time it failed in the opposite direction. On February 26, 2022, the West decided to remove Russia from the SWIFT system and froze $300 billion of Russian foreign exchange reserves. Historically, this was the strongest move of financial sanctions, and it created a huge expectation in the Western world that Russia's economic collapse would occur within a few months. However, contrary to expectations, the Russian economy recovered from this blow in a short time. The Western strategy aimed to push Russia out of the global financial system, isolate it, and create a kind of financial dead end. But Russia, instead of being thrown out of global trade, turned toward alternative systems. The ruble quickly regained value, and energy trade shifted direction. Countries began conducting trade in alternative currencies such as the yuan, rupee, dirham, and ruble. Especially the growth of China's CIP's China International payment system signaled the emergence of a global financial network that would defend Russia's interests. The unexpected result of being removed from SWIFT led to new energy agreements between China and Russia. During this period, central banks accelerated gold purchases and began diversifying their reserves. This process caused gold purchases to reach the highest levels since the 1970s. The West was forced to accept that the petrodollar order was coming to an end. Saudi Arabia began using the yuan and oil trade with China, which delivered a serious blow to the long-standing petrodollar system. At that moment, the world saw clearly that financial power could collapse not through direct war, but through economic means. The world was now seeking alternative paths against financial hegemony. While the SWIFT system was once seen as absolute, power alternatives to this system were now rapidly forming. This time, the financial weapon, instead of destroying its target, showed the world a way out. Russia, rather than being excluded from the global financial system, built alternative financial structures, and the world stepped into a multipolar economic order. With these new structures, the power held by the West was no longer as effective as before, because everyone had begun turning toward new alternative systems. Change in the global financial order is shaped by historical cycles. The lifespan of a reserve currency is limited, and over time it gives way to new ones. This was a pattern seen in the past between the decline of the British pound and the rise of the United States dollar. However, now, alongside the rise of the dollar, we are watching the slow collapse of this order. After 2025, the share of the dollar as a global reserve currency will gradually decrease. This is not only a financial transformation, but also a symbol of the birth of a multipolar world order. With the decline of the dollar, BRICS countries have begun to discuss the idea of creating a common currency. China, India, Brazil, Russia, and South Africa are increasing their economic power and seeking alternatives. To the West-centered financial system, gold digital currencies and regional payment systems will increasingly come to the forefront. Each of them is laying the foundation for new payment systems and trade agreements in different regions. America is now losing the advantage of unlimited money printing. This means more external debt-high inflation and internal economic pressures. The old dollar system will pass into history as a lost dominance of financial hegemony, even if America's control over the dollar weakens global trade. And the economy will evolve toward a multipolar structure. This is not a collapse, but the story of rejecting a single-centered power. The collapse of the dollar should be defined as the loss of dominance. This process will build a new, multipolar financial world to replace old power structures. Each region will have more independent financial systems in line with its own economic interests. This is a sign of a new world order where international trade will be more balanced and independent.